Hello, everyone. Welcome to this, the third installment of the Power and Allure of Dictators, an Adventures and Ideas seminar with Carolina Public Humanities. We do not join you from the Flyleaf Studios tonight. We always want to make sure that our speakers and members of our staff are comfortable with our arrangements, and today we are doing it by Zoom. The rest of this seminar will be done in a more traditional Zoom format, so we do want to make you aware of that. But we want to thank, of course, Flyleaf Books for being such a great host for us for the opening of the seminar, and we will be returning to Flyleaf Books for some events that I'll mention in a few moments here. We do want to, besides thanking Flyleaf Books for being such great partners with us, want to always thank our sponsors for our programs, the Cotton Merker Group at Morgan Stanley, wonderful supporter of our programs, the Carolina Meadows, a retirement community in Chapel Hill, also a fantastic partner of ours for our publicizing and putting out our Adventures and Ideas and Humanities in Action programs, as well as coming on and supporting our K-12 programs. And our partner this fall, especially for a lot of our virtual programming, the General Alumni Association. We're really, really happy to be partnering with them. They're getting the word out far and wide that our programs are available, and we're glad to be partnering with them, especially with our program coming up this Friday, tomorrow. Oh, no, sorry, it's Wednesday, on Friday. Our first installment of Lunch with Friends and Strangers. And that is a wonderful program. We're going to be with our dear friend, certainly a friend, Lloyd Kramer, and we'll be discussing Lafayette, and should be a wonderful way to kick off that series. So please go to humanities.unc.edu to check that out. All of the list of great people that we'll be meeting. Billie Jean King, Ida B. Wells, Leonid Brezhnev. It's an odd party, but that's how we do it here at humanities.unc.edu. Also, we want to encourage you to come to our Humanities in Action program next Wednesday. We'll be back in the Flyleaf Studios, and we'll be having a really wonderful talk with a new scholar here at UNC, Dirk Moses, who will be speaking on a very grim topic, and that is, of course, genocide. And we'll be looking, so please come and take a look at that program. We'd love to have you for that. Next Thursday, we're kicking off our salon conversations. Dr. Lloyd Kramer will be leading a very interesting discussion with our new, and there's Dr. Kramer right there. So Dr. Kramer, since you're right there, maybe you can tell us what the conversation will be next Thursday night.
Thanks very much. Yes, on Thursday, we're going to be having a discussion of Molly Worthen's article, recently published in the New York Times, an article about the theme of empathy, and whether it is a positive emotion, whether it's condescending, whether it creates problems, and how is empathy understood in today's cultural context.
Great. So I know how you feel. So come on to our program. You can register for that also at humanities.unc.edu. And of course, more seminars coming up. There's an election seminar coming up. Lloyd Kramer will be speaking at that. And we use you a lot, Lloyd, but everyone loves to hear your voice and see your face. And of course, we have wonderful programs. So I don't want to list them all. I want to drive you to our website, humanities.unc.edu. Please come and check it out. While you're thinking of our public programs, we also hope that you consider giving to Carolina Public Humanities this season, knowing that what we are doing, of course, responsible for bringing the faculty and excellent scholarship of UNC out into the community. And one of the ways we do that, of course, is our K-12 teacher workshop programs and our community college outreach. So those continue in a virtual way, of course, right now, but we could use all the support to make sure that those wonderful programs and our mission can continue serving those communities. So without further ado, I think we should get right to the topic at hand. I want to first, we're going to be dropping the official biography or the page for our speaker, Dr. Anna Krylova, into the chat here for you so that you can read all the accolades and look at the wonderful scholarship. But what I like to do in our intros is to say, why did we invite this person? And there's a really important reason for that, both because we love to work with our fellows over at Duke University and create these cross-institutional collaborations, but also because in this seminar, there was a thread running through Rome, and then looking at yesterday, I postulated about a nationalist form of dictatorship that should be recognizable in some areas, but there's a whole other realm of dictatorship that we've come to understand in the 20th century, and that is, of course, dictatorships that are using a communist ideology or other ideologies as well. So we thought it was an important contribution to the idea of dictator to have someone come and talk about a communist dictator. And I think one of the first ones that jumps out at you might be, of course, Joseph Stalin. And we are delighted to welcome, and you can see we have Dr. Krylova's information down here if you're interested in finding out more about all the great work. The last time Dr. Krylova worked with us, we gave an excellent talk on Soviet women in combat, an absolutely fascinating topic. I think we want to bring you back for more of that if you're ever interested. But for now, we're very interested in this new work. I had a wonderful preliminary conversation with Dr. Krylova on Friday, and I got a tease of what we're going to get. So please welcome Dr. Anna Krylova with Stalin, Ideology and Terror. Take it away.
Thank you very much. And thank you for having me. I have to admit that I would have much rather give a talk about Soviet women in combat, the subject that I keep coming back and always actually find more and more interesting research and actually finding a way to talk about the Soviet Union through the story in different ways.
You have an open invitation from us, okay?
Perfect. That's what we're going to do. But yes, today we're going to talk about Stalin. My interest in Stalin actually is part of my second book that is called Imagining Socialism in the Soviet Century. It's the book that covers the whole 20th century, the 70 years of the Soviet rule. And I spent a lot of time on the 1920s and 1930s thinking about how we can actually find a different way to understand what actually the Stalin phenomenon meant in the Soviet Union, why it happened, was it actually very short-lived. For me, it's also very important to always remind us that the Stalinist cult basically did discontinue in 1953, and the Soviet society did go through a very serious de-Stalinization policy, kind of campaign, and also authored a lot of de-Stalinization policies. So we're talking about the dictator who actually had very strict chronological dates, but nevertheless, it's still it's a very long period of time. And I was thinking, how can we actually enter and start talking about this Russian Soviet phenomenon? And I thought that we actually might as well to just come at the moment into the Soviet history when Stalin has already secured himself as a political dictator, and who, like somewhere in 1936, 1937, when Stalin had already become the most powerful man in the state and in the party, and was in the process of getting rid of his political opponents very actively. At the same time, 1936 is the year when Stalin and the Communist Party announces that socialism actually had been already built in the Soviet Union. Most importantly and interestingly, that Stalin and the Communist Party also announced that the class struggle de facto discontinued in the Soviet Union, and therefore what the Soviet society should be looking forward to is harmonious life, happy life. And I will start my presentation now. I think we tried it already. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. It's I was looking through what I did. Okay. So that's why I thought that we can actually look at some posters from mid-1930s, around the time when the Stalinist constitution was signed up and voted by the Supreme Soviet, so that we can actually look at the colors of the Stalinist cult. These are joyful colors. The poster says, "Thank you, comrade Stalin, dear Stalin, for our happy childhood." This is the children, very young Communist League children, are thanking Stalin for building socialism. And we can also see that actually we can see children's faces which come from different Soviet republics. We actually have a kind of very broad scope of ethnicity types in this poster. This is a very unexpected way to look at this, to begin at least looking at the Stalinist cult, to recognize that the message of dictatorship was actually very colorful and joyful, and the dictatorship promised happiness to the Soviet society. So there is another more grandiose poster that says, "Beloved Stalin, thank you. Beloved Stalin is the happiness of the people." And here are just a few posters that actually connect the name of Stalin to the signing of the Constitution of 1936 that actually proclaimed the socialism in the Soviet Union. So we can definitely see that the personality of Stalin over dominates like all these posters. And I can actually show you enormous amount, basically like endless amount of posters. But showing posters is somewhat problematic because we will never know actually whether people had seen them, like what did they think when they actually saw those posters. And I think when historians actually study the Stalinist cult, they very much recognize that a lot of people didn't pay attention to posters, a lot of people actually looked through the posters. So at some point when the posters and the imagery of the dictatorship becomes too oppressive, you just actually tend to look through them and you tend not to notice those posters. And I know about it from my own experience as someone who was growing up in the 80s in the Soviet Union. I actually didn't notice a lot of Soviet propaganda. I like when I was buying Soviet posters later, already like 15 years later, I was surprised that, oh, actually I must have seen these posters, but actually I was quite clearly that I didn't register them. So I thought a better way to introduce actually how Stalin himself perceived his dictatorship and his image for, and how he molded it for the Soviet society would be to look at one particular movie from 1938, about which I know for a fact that Stalin actually participated in editing the movie. And the movie in question is Alexander Nevsky, that was made in 1938, as I already said. And this is the portrait of the main character of the movie. And I would define it as a well-timed propaganda of high artistic quality. The reason why it was exceptionally well done movie for the period, because it was a collaboration of Soviet and world-renowned filmmaker Sergei Eisenstein, who actually, I love the picture of Eisenstein here. He's very young, and he's probably actually editing the battleship Potemkin in this picture and not Alexander Nevsky, because he should have been older in 1938. And also of Soviet and world-renowned composer Sergei Prokofiev. So if you have never seen an historic epic as a musical, where music actually is classical music, then you should definitely go and check out Sergei Eisenstein's and Sergei Prokofiev's Alexander Nevsky. So this is the image. So what we're interested in this movie, we're interested in the main character, Prince Alexander Nevsky. The movie as a whole is a historic epic that basically depicts a conflict between the Teutonic Knights of the Holy Roman Empire and the Russian people of Novgorod, the city of Novgorod. This movie even though the movie actually takes the viewer to the battlegrounds of medieval battlegrounds, the movie was speaking very directly to the contemporary viewer by calling Teutonic Knights Germans, by talking about how actually Russian people will be fighting against Germans, and there will be how the German knights would be overthrown and destroyed by the sword of the Russian people. So the conversation that takes place in the movie is directly related to the upcoming war. And the character of Alexander Nevsky is very important because every scene in which the actor who played Alexander Nevsky appeared was approved by Stalin, was edited by Stalin. Stalin in general was very, very deeply engaged in the production of socialist literature, Soviet movies, and also Soviet music. And he regularly met with Soviet writers, giving them advice and actually asking them about their creative plans and the plans for the future. So the prince, as it was presented to the Soviet people, would be someone who, I will just kind of list a few characteristics that you can definitely take out of this movie. This is a prince who has a lot of comrades, who always thinks about his achievements and his plans for the future in collaboration with his own kind of small army that consists, that we definitely can think about as correlating to the Central Committee of the Communist Party. Alexander Nevsky also is a very important military leader. He always participates in combat himself, usually leading the troops and fighting along regular soldiers. He also defies not only the rule of the assault of the West that the Teutonic Knights represent in the movie, but also the Mongol invasion that by the 13th century would have taken as far as nearly up to the Novgorod, but not that far. So Novgorod will be still not under the control of the Mongols, but nevertheless there will be constant kind of interactions between Prince and the Mongol princes. And also, this is the prince who is intolerant of any kind of betrayal and punishes enemies and those who betray him very severely. And he is, yes, basically, we can also already see the kind of the similarity that this image definitely comes from Soviet posters, and where the prince actually also loves, saves, and enjoys spending time with children. So the reason why, and this actually goes back to my general interest, and this is also the prince who supports women in combat. Like, this is the main female character, Vasilisa, who joins the troops because she has an innate gift for combat, and then at the end of the movie, she is proclaimed to be the most courageous warrior of all, like above everyone else. So the reason why I wanted to look at this movie and the images that I showed is because I know for a fact that everyone in the Soviet Union at that time saw this movie. So this is the Soviet cinematography would probably, like, so in 1930s you would not have a lot of movies done every year. There would be about 5-6 movies that you could actually watch. Every movie will be shown all over the country, and usually the same movie will be watched 2 or 3 times by just kind of continuously. So people will not just watch it once; they would watch it 2 or 3 times, and they will also know the dialogues that take place in the movie. And without knowing, they also will kind of internalize the imagery that this movie is putting forward. And I hope that we have already noticed that this movie is of highest quality. Highest artistic quality. It's a very interesting, like, if I would define it, I would define it as a combination of photography and cinematography, where Eisenstein constantly uses his skills as a very skillful photographer who can actually work with light very, very powerfully, but also a cinematographer who can also make things move in a very effective way. And sometimes students actually ask me why the Teutonic Knights are dressed in white and why the Russian troops actually are dressed in gray and black. And they would be asking me about some deep historical reasons for that particular opposition. And I would usually say, well, actually there are aesthetic reasons. Eisenstein needed contrast in his movie. He needed contrast between white and gray and black, and that's what actually would make this movie like a masterpiece. So if we will kind of conclude what the language that Stalin constructs for himself through this movie, he presents himself to the people as someone who can protect the country. And that basically was I would characterize it as a social contract, where people actually recognized positive features and negative features about the Soviet rule, but there was a very clear understanding with the society that the next war is definitely approaching, and the sense that Stalin had been rebuilding the country and had been preparing the country for that war and could lead the war and could protect the people would be the main message of this movie. So in this regard, the fact that at exactly the same time, in 1938, actually starting in 1937, these are the same years of the Great Terror. And so the Great Terror, and we usually date it between 1937 and 1939. So this movie, with this very reassuring message, comes out basically in the middle of the Great Terror. And the question, of course, we can ask, like, why exactly this terror is taking place? But before we even ask this question, I just want to offer us just one episode of this terror and also to give us numbers of what actually it meant to carry out the Great Terror in the Soviet Union in 1930s. So my episode begins on June 11th in 1937, when a military Soviet court sentenced Mikhail Tukhachevsky, who was the marshal of the Red Army, and a group of senior officers who had been with the Red Army since early 1920s, sometimes actually some of them since the Russian Civil War, to execution. They were executed hours after the sentence was announced. And this was not the end of the purge, that was just the beginning, because over the next year, about 30,000 officers were discharged from the Red Army. Thousands of them will be either imprisoned or executed. We don't know exactly numbers. And also, the purge will last until 1939, and after 1939, some of the officers will be reintegrated back into the Soviet, into the Red Army. And also, we need to kind of recognize that who Mikhail Tukhachevsky was for the Soviet people in 1930s. This was a world-renowned military professional officer and a major strategist of World War II combat. So by 1937, what Mikhail Tukhachevsky actually had written about the next war, how society should actually imagine the next war, how the Soviet army should fight the next war, that was basically, that belonged to this man. And in the Soviet Union, he was the icon of the Red Army. So just to add a little bit more kind of context to this moment, the military purge would be a central moment in the broader Great Terror. And if we just look at numbers, and I call this documentable numbers, because until very recently, it was very difficult. We didn't know the exact numbers of how many people actually were arrested, how many people were executed, how many people died in between arrest and getting to the camps in Siberia and Central Asia. And what were actually the total deaths of the Great Terror. Now we actually can definitely talk about exact numbers because archives had been opened in early 90s and historians have done their job. They actually counted the documents that actually now are in Russian archives. So the military purge by standards of the Great Terror was not a big purge. It only discharged 30,000 people, and in particular, some percentage of them actually were executed over a period of 2 years. But society-wide, more than 1,370,000 people actually were arrested. So it's a shocking number. Even though during the Cold War, people were speculating that 20 million people were arrested, which was not a very realistic estimation. Like now, when we look at this exact number, that is over 1 million people, this also still tells us how many other million of people actually were involved in arresting, in processing, in sending people to camps. Out of this, over 1 million people, 681,000 were executed between 37 and 38. And since people do die in labor camps and on the way to labor camps, and also having returned from labor camps, total deaths are somewhere around 1 million people. So we are talking about a major dramatic event that took place over 2-3 years. And actually was constantly it didn't end really in 1938, just because people will be moved to labor camps and there will be also then, some of them will be returning. So this, and I wanted to give this number so that we can actually restate this question, what was the point of the Great Purge? Because we're not talking about the elite of the state. We're not talking about party elite, state elite, or military elite. We're talking about kind of a huge chunk of society that was taken out and then processed and executed. And we can, of course, ask, did it contribute to security of the country, bracing for total war? And most people say, no, of course it didn't. Some historians will say, well, in fact, it was a very risky undertaking for a dictator who had already secured his political power, who had not been forcefully opposed by anyone, to carry out such a terror campaign could have actually cost him his own dictatorship that he had been building for a long time. So if anything, if we will look from this perspective at the Great Terror, we'll think, well, it was somewhat potentially suicidal as far as Stalin was concerned, and he should have known that. That's why it is interesting to start thinking, like, why did he still think it was worth it? And what was the goal of that suicidal campaign? So we have a number of explanatory paradigms that are available to us, and they have been available since 1930s. So the first explanatory paradigm is desire, I would call it desire for total power paradigm, where we will just, scholars and journalists and writers will actually talk about Stalin's need to accumulate total control over the country. And a lot of historians will object to this paradigm because they will say, well, he had already done it. Like, there was no reason for him to, that has already taken place. So another, and also what we can't really explain through this paradigm, we cannot really explain why such a dramatic scale why the purges actually have taken such a dramatic scale, where millions of people actually were involved in this great purges. If Stalin wanted to accumulate, kind of amass the power, getting rid of the elite that could have potentially opposed him should have been enough, right? Another explanation is usually refers to Stalin's paranoia, which also is remarkably it's remarkably unsubstantiated theory, because we virtually know nothing about Stalin as far as his medical conditions are concerned. We don't know what medications he took. We don't know whether he was sick, when he was sick, what actually his problems were. We can speculate, of course, but actually there is no historical data that can allow us to paint a psychological portrait of the dictator. So, and we also can, okay, I'm just gonna go forward. So I think that there is a very interesting, another kind of explanation that was authored already in 1930s. And we find it in Nikolai Bukharin's letters from the prison. Just a few words about Nikolai Bukharin. Nikolai Bukharin was one of the most beloved old Bolsheviks of the Communist Party. A very close friend of Lenin, a recognized authority in Marxism. He was one of the architects of Soviet economic policy in 1920s, an editor of a major newspaper responsible for ideological and cultural work in the Communist Party and in the country. And also he was a very advanced scholar. He was one of the founders of the new field of the history of science in the 1930s. Marxists had direct impact on actually starting history of science because they thought that science is actually also historically contingent, and therefore it needs to be now studied not as science that produces the truth about the world or society, but actually how scientific research is always already impacted and integrated into society and its own biases. So Nikolai Bukharin was arrested in 1937, and he also, of course, like it would be impossible for Bukharin and Stalin not to be very close allies, comrades, and also close friends. Right. So when he was imprisoned in 1937, he knew that he was very likely to die because a number of his close comrades and comrades of Stalin had been already executed. And while in prison, he wrote a philosophical book. He wrote a novel, and he also wrote 7 letters to Stalin. And he was writing to Stalin because Stalin was his friend. He was not begging for forgiveness. He was just trying to figure out what was going on, why so many people are actually being massed in prisons, why executions are taking place. He was not aware of true scale of what was taking place, but he knew that a significant chunk of the Communist Party was definitely under attack, and the military was under attack. So he's contemplating in his letters, and this is what he wrote in one of his letters as he was trying to figure out Stalin. And he wrote, there is some kind of big and bold idea about general purge, in connection with preparation for war, in connection with transition to democracy, meaning to socialism, socialist democracy. This purge captures the guilty, the suspicious, and potentially suspicious. So I want to look at the peculiar language Bukharin's letter uses. In particular, the suspicious and the potential suspicious. What could this language possibly mean if we read it from the legal point of view? Like, why would the party be interested in catching out the suspicious and specifically potentially suspicious people? And how can you know who is potentially suspicious? Because potentially suspicious means that something actually will take place in the future. So if this is the goal of the purge, how do you plan who to arrest? How do you determine who is guilty? How do you determine to what degree the person potentially can be guilty that this person actually should be responsible for something that he clearly hadn't done yet? So this is, so I think that in order to answer these questions, we actually need to try to figure out the political mindset, not only of Stalin, but of the Communist Party and of the Soviet leadership in 1930s. Because kind of my guess would be that what Stalin was doing was not a secret just only to him. A lot of people could understand the basic rationale behind what was taking place, especially those who were involved in arresting and purging and processing masses of people. And I would tell you right away that I believe that Bukharin was right on the spot when he actually articulated why this purge was taking place. So what we need to figure out is just to figure out what the words that he used actually meant in concrete terms. So first I would like to, and I'm going to introduce us to several ideas that I would say constituted political unconsciousness and philosophical unconsciousness of the Soviet state, the Communist Party, and people who had been within the system for at least already 15, 17 years. So we need to remind ourselves about the founding myths of the first proletarian republic and the fact that actually this was the first proletarian republic in the world that was aspiring to become a socialist republic. The first part in the first kind of chapter in this myth of this new republic would be the myth about not the myth, but we can call it a myth about the capitalist encirclement and vulnerability of the republic itself. So for the Soviet leadership, the fact of grabbing the power into their hands was immediately associated with remarkable anxiety about not just keeping it, but preserving the first proletarian republic until socialist revolutions take place actually somewhere in Western Europe. And the difficulty of this task was also very apparent and clear to them. They actually didn't really count that would be possible under conditions under geopolitical conditions of early 20th century, unless Western proletariat actually would join the ranks of the Russian proletariat. So this poster is from the early 1920s, shows us that it's Lenin who is trying to get rid of all the non-proletarian classes of the world, kings, what the Soviets will call the representatives of the religious cult, and also he would try to so the idea that this poster is captures for us is that the Russian Revolution success depended not only on overcoming the resistance within the country, but also overcoming the resistance and the capitalist resistance in the whole world. So to this idea, so this is what this is just the posters from early 1920s, where the proletariat is presented as being opposed to kind of the survival of proletariat republic is presented as conditional on the death of capitalism. And if capitalism prevails, then the proletariat republic actually has no chance to survive in Russia. What we also need to remind ourselves about is that when the Bolsheviks decided to take power in their hands, they were very much counting on the world revolution to take place in Western Europe in the nearest future. They calculated that if the Russian proletariat actually undertakes a revolution in Russia, then out of the sense of solidarity, the proletariat of Western Europe would join the ranks and also will organize their own revolutions in individual countries. And once successful, those better developed countries actually will be able to help out the Russian Republic that of course actually was not yet prepared to undergo a major socialist revolution and build socialism itself. So by early 20s, it became very clear to the Bolsheviks that the world revolution is not going to take place in Western Europe. And this is also the beginning of the conversation about the betrayal of European proletariat. So the communist leadership of the Soviet Union felt not only encircled by capitalist enemies, but also felt deeply betrayed by those who should have been their allies, the Western proletariat. There were a number of short-lived proletarian revolutions, like Soviet revolutions in Bavaria and in Hungary, but they lasted about several months, and then they were overcome by social democrats who were in power. So, and this is the image from the Communist International Journal that was published in Moscow, where the proletariat stands in relation to its chains, and this proletariat basically depicts not only the Russian proletariat, but proletariat of the whole world. Right. So the Bolsheviks were also aware that that they actually took power in a country that was economically underdeveloped, that was also economically destroyed by World War I and the Civil War, and they were also very deeply aware about their military powerlessness. So this is the situation where the Communist Party cannot possibly feel secure, and I would argue that this moment of coming to power without knowing beforehand that the chances of preserving what had been just conquered actually are very slim, constitutes kind of the traumatic founding moment of the proletarian republic and of the Soviet state. So. But Bolsheviks also had very deep anxiety about the Russian society and military from the very beginning also. To them, society was subject to deep security anxieties, and also the army was subject to was believed to be in a kind of facing a near constant threat of subversion. What exactly does this mean? I mean, I think that one way to put it in a very concise way is that the Bolsheviks were always afraid to be stabbed, not in the back, not only by the West, but also by their own society. And the perceived threats actually could be listed, and the list will be a very long list. So potential threats that Bolsheviks will identify to the Soviet Republic will be former imperial non-proletarian classes, which basically would mean everyone else in the society except the working class. And if we remember that the Russian proletariat was not a very big group even before 1917, it was about 2 million people. By early 1920s, the Russian proletariat basically became halved, and some would actually say that there was nothing left from the Russian proletariat, because the Russian working class participated very actively in the Russian Revolution and the Civil War. And by the time the Civil War was won and the Bolsheviks could claim their victory, they de facto lost the minimum social support, like physical social support, that they had in 1917. So if they were suspicious of non-proletarian classes, it is safe to say that they were suspicious of everyone in the Soviet society except the workers, and the workers actually were very much in short supply at the time. So there were, and those people who they would be suspicious of would include former imperial officers, even those imperial officers who actually having opposed the seizure of power by the Bolsheviks. And in addition to this group, we can also talk about peasant soldiers. So the Communist Party of the Soviet Union perceived soldiers, or peasant soldiers, as potential merchants, potentially people who are potentially interested in trading and therefore becoming capitalists, dreaming about becoming richer and taking advantage of market economy of the Soviet Union in 1920s. So this, if this is not enough, we can just extend this. So we can also say, well, we're really talking about society at large, but I will just add to this groups just middle classes, professionals, everyone who the Soviet state actually would need, but at the same time would not be able ever to trust. Right. So. And here we can also mention the collectivization of 1928 that dispossessed all Russian peasants of the land that had been granted to them by revolution, forced them into collective farms, and also de facto divided those peasants into those who were supposed to be more loyal to the Soviet power and less loyal to the Soviet power. Those who were considered to be more loyal would be forced to join the collective farms. Those who were less loyal would not be allowed to join the collective farm campaign, but would be actually arrested and also sent to Siberia to build their own settlements and start from scratch. So after 1928, the Communist Party would be very correct to assess that the support among the peasantry in the country would be basically coming close to zero. Right. And we can also ask, what about the new Soviet generation, those people who actually would be born around 1917 and would be already coming out of Soviet schools by mid-1930s, late 1930s? Well, this would be a very important group of people who, of course, could be trusted and could be trusted for their loyalty. But nevertheless, this group would only be about 40 million people. At the most, if we will include children at the age of 7 and children at the age of 17, this will be like a group of 40 million people, and of course they would not constitute the majority. They would be still in a minority. But I would like to go even deeper than actually just looking at quite obvious enemy, kind of enemy types that the Soviet, that Bolsheviks and the Communist Party actually imagined for themselves. I want to look at the Bolshevik mindset and kind of ask a question: what did they see when they looked at workers? What did they see? What did they see when they look at middle class? How did they imagine human nature? And I think that we need to recognize that there were very significant differences between the Bolshevik Marxism style and the classic Marxist worldview that we probably are more familiar than actually with Bolshevik Marxism. So my premise would be that it was impossible to be a Marxist on Marxist terms in the early 20th century. It was impossible to read Marx and internalize his ideas and study his scholarship without actually reading Marx through the prism of political, scientific, social scientific discourse in which you were born. And this is where we would so if we will look at what happened to popular ideas, social sciences, and even hard sciences by the beginning of the 20th century, we actually will start noticing significant differentiation between, for example, how Marx and Marxists and socialists of the late 19th century thought about society, and how Bolsheviks would end up thinking about society and class. So if we read Marx, we would, of course, find there the notion of class consciousness as a predominant device for understanding society and human nature. So a few words about this the concept of consciousness, right? So we can, Marx, of course, was aware that people had desires, that they had unconscious drives. He's very eloquent in his writing to point out to that side of human nature, but when he would be talking about, when he would be imagining how history is supposed to unfold, how historical actors are supposed to act, why the proletariat is supposed to actually become conscious of its own position in society, and also then the concept of class consciousness and the possibility of consciousness would be predominant for Marx. And the possibility of consciousness basically assured Marx and Marxists that an individual who lives in a society in a particular social position is capable of understanding the injustice that is being done to him. And therefore, and having come to this understanding, he would be interested in studying the reasons for that type of injustice, and would like to somehow impact the injustices that he had been given, but he actually has been given without consent. So here, the premise that people are rational beings, that they can observe and analyze, they can make decisions, and they can act upon those decisions is paramount. Without this presumption, it's very difficult to explain why Marx, even without providing a clear explanation, believed that working class actually will somehow acquire class consciousness and will actually offer that class consciousness of a better society to the rest of the society. Everyone in the world, right? So the Bolshevik, if we look at Bolshevik writing in early 20th century and throughout 1920s and 30s, we will actually find a much richer vocabulary that they used at the time. They will be constantly talking about class psychology. There will be notions of the unconscious life of different classes. There will be also very strong discourse about socially conditioned instincts, and every class would have a different social conditioned instinct, or a different set of instincts. In addition to that, they will be also invoking terms like structure of feelings, spontaneous class behavior. So if, before I can get here. So what we actually see is that we actually can already detect that the Bolsheviks and Bolshevik intellectuals had been very familiar, had been very much informed by scientific discourses and social sciences of the early 20th century. I don't want to go through all the readings and writings that they've done, but very important names for the Bolshevik worldview would be German sociology, Werner Sombart, who actually worked very closely with the notion of class instinct of the working class, specifically of the working class, but also of course presuming that every class has its own unconscious set of rationales that allow a person to make decisions without constantly processing what's happening. Like the kind of what is the undergirding system of categories that this class actually uses that allows it to act spontaneously and at a given particular moment. So Bolsheviks will be also very much interested in French anthropology and sociology, and Gustave Le Bon will be a very often citation in works of Lenin, Trotsky, and Bukharin. And of course, psychoanalysis. And Trotsky actually was very much in, like, I want to say in love with psychoanalysis, but that might not be actually an exaggeration, because if we read Trotsky's writings from the 1910s, that he published in a number of newspapers and journals in Russia, you can see that he's using psychoanalysis to analyze how middle class people behave in different social and revolution situations. So so Trotsky and a lot of his allies also will be very much versed in different forms of psychoanalysis. And then of course we can also mention Russian physiology and Ivan Pavlov, who is the author of the concept and theory of conditioned reflex. So if we look at the screen and we will look at sociology, anthropology, psychoanalysis, physiology, this list defines the peculiarity of early 20th century social sciences that actually are importing into themselves categories of thought and analysis of physiology and hard sciences. And actually, I also just been recently rereading Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, and if you read Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, his language is profoundly this language of social sciences. He constantly talks about instincts, electricity, unconsciousness, unconscious drives, and instincts. So so he's writing in late 19th century. This is the beginning of this this way of thinking about society, where society actually acquires a much more complex structure. It's not just what people think scientists should be preoccupied with, but also what how that thought is being conditioned and organized and prepared in advance, and as well as social behavior. So one can say that the Bolsheviks actually had a very sophisticated framework of analysis. So they were not just they were interested in an unconscious makeup of different social groups. They were also interested, of course, in conscious self-awareness. But I would suggest that they were a lot more concerned about the unconscious makeups of different classes than actually with conscious self-awareness of those classes. So if we will look at this so the Soviet society in 1920s and 1930s consists of different class types. People don't have identities, they have class identities. A person can claim that he is not a working class person, but because he was actually coming from the working class background, he would be identified as a working class person. But in 1920s, usually you would not be arguing about this identification, because this identification actually was something that helped you in society. But if a middle class person, or who the Bolsheviks will call bourgeois person, will actually say that he had deeply internalized the working class ideology, he read Marx and he learned Marx extremely well, and he agrees that socialism should be built that socialism is a more advanced and a fairer society. This type of statement will not be taken for granted. It will be taken always with a sense of doubt, whether the person is really saying what he's thinking, and even if the person thinks that he's saying what he's thinking, whether at the time when the trial of his actual commitment to the Bolshevik Republic would come, would his unconsciousness support his conscious statements? So this type of analysis is very prevalent in Bolshevik social sciences, in Marxist Bolshevik social science in 1920s. Also, this is the time, like if you just read the minutes of Communist Party congresses that will take place very regularly in 1920s and 1930s, you would see that this is the internal language of the party. That leaders of the Communist Party, Bukharin, Stalin, and those who and names that I hadn't mentioned, so I don't want necessarily to bring them up, and Trotsky, of course, they actually would accuse each other of not having or claiming having working class instinct. So an accusation of not having working class instinct would be the worst accusation, undermining persons kind of political career. So this is the cover of one of the most famous proletarian novels called Cement, and it features the main characters who are all, with one exception, are proletarian characters. So when a Soviet person of the 1920s would look at this cover, he would immediately recognize working class personalities by the way they're dressed, by the way their faces are presented. They actually have to have very hard chins, very straightforward features, and they also will be able to guess kind of the structure of feelings of these people, where the working class Red Army soldier would be already immediately entitled with having a particular class instinct that allows him unconsciously to figure out injustices and injustices of the society, and also instinctively ally himself with the Communist Party agenda. And that will not be the case with those people who in this particular poster are right in the front. This is middle class people. They're dressed like middle class people, and they have a completely, they will be understood as having a completely different structure of feelings, and they would not be kind of inherently trustworthy in the Soviet society. So here in these posters, we actually see different class types being very being very differently dressed. And it's easy to differentiate between working class people, former middle class people who still dress like middle class people. By mid 1930s, that will not be so simple any longer, because the Soviet people actually will start, they will leave behind their working class identifications and middle class identifications of the earlier regime, and they will start wearing modern suits, modern dresses. And this is kind of a very interesting moment in Stalin's Russia, where all the class differences that were on the surface actually suddenly start disappearing, because people start wearing the same clothing, but at the same time, the anxiety about what these people are actually hiding and what they can potentially be hiding becomes very acute. So this is the poster, do not speak to the enemy. If you chat with an enemy, you help the enemy. So the two characters in the poster are dressed exactly the same. They actually look very similar. We can see, but the character who is clearly an enemy of the people has kind of the meaning of this person as actually hidden, and you cannot see if you just look at the surface of this person. You actually need to figure out you need to create kind of an archaeology of this person to figure out what he's made of and what he can potentially mean for the Soviet to the security of the Soviet Union, right? So I would suggest that this is so the Bolsheviks came into power with a very sophisticated philosophical political worldview. At the same time, once you start turning this political worldview into policies and into kind of policies of how exactly you're going to interact with these people, the Communist Party ended up not being able to trust its own population. So it's a very peculiar situation where it actually, at some point, it became not important what people would say and what they would claim as being their true self. And it will be more important of trying to figure out what their potential, what they might be hiding, that they're not even aware that they're hiding that. So I think that this is one way to explain particular features of the Great Terror. We can explain why the scope was so wide. Why actually millions of people had to be taken out of the society? Why did this kind of the Stalinist leadership, Stalin himself in particular, decided to throw his net so wide and not actually just concentrate on the top leaders of the Communist Party, of the Red Army, and of the state? It also explains the format of this particular event. It was an extra legal moment. You could not possibly, so Stalinist leadership decided not to process all these millions of people through Soviet courts, because in Soviet courts, so you would be actually looking for evidence. You would be finding out whether people had done anything wrong. Had they been even, you would not even be asking had they thought wrong thoughts. You would be mostly preoccupied with finding out wrongdoings that had already taken place. So the extra legal system that Stalin and his and the Central Committee under his leadership organized this action. That extra legal system would consist of 3-man committees organized all over the country, and these 3-man committees usually will consist of a regional or local party leader, secret service leader, and also usually some representative of the Soviet state. Right. So these 3-man committees actually will be specifically asking very different questions about people that will be delivered to them. They will be not interested in evidence. They will be interested in probability. And that makes us realize that people who were arrested were remarkably vulnerable people, because it is absolutely impossible to defend yourself on the accusation of probability of you possibly doing something wrong in the future, like within the next several years. So here the focus, of course, is on the next war. The focus is on the next war and how people will behave if the enemy actually invades, and if the enemy actually will try to take advantage of these social anxieties and antagonisms that the Soviet society had, and the Soviet leaders were very accurately aware of those problems. So now, if we look back at Bukharin's letter, we actually can start, like, I think it's brilliant. It's a brilliant insight just a few weeks before he was executed. So he is absolutely right that when he says that the purges captures the guilty, and the guilty, of course, will constitute actually very small. I don't even know if there were any guilty people, probably not, right? But the suspicious and the potential suspicious are definitely were definitely the majority of the people who actually created the mass for this purge. So this is the end. And I would like just to to sum up saying, well, when we think about Stalin's cult, we actually need to think about the importance of ideology, this power of the state, and of course peculiarities of individual leaders. So if Stalin was prone to suspicion, the ideology that he inherited and also partially created was just the worst fit for him and for the country.
Great, thank you so much. Why don't we pull down the screen here, and what we'll do is it's a really wonderful perspective on dictatorship. We're looking at the ideology behind it, and the idea that these are shared ideas, not just pushed from the top down, but shared from the bottom up, is a very interesting perspective on dictatorship, and one that we should very much be aware of. So I'm going to, let me see if I can pull down the screen here. Anna, could you, or Paul, perhaps could you pull down Bukharin's letter, only because it scares me a little bit. Or let me see if I can do it.
Shall I just leave my full share?
Yeah, there you go. That's good. Yeah, that's good. That way we can see. And folks, you can always choose whether you'd like the speaker view or the gallery view. I'm going to now go to our questions here, and we have 6 questions, folks. You can always use the question and answer box at the bottom. I'm going to start with the question that came in the middle of the talk from Mark De La Rosa. Hello, Mark. What was the crime of Mikhail, and now I wish I could remember the General Chechevsky, please forgive me, the person in 1937 that gave him the death sentence. What was the crime that he was arrested for and specifically charged with?
He was charged with betrayal. He was charged with working for Nazi Germany. So this is basically he was charged with high treason. And officers who were working with him were charged the same. I also can add to that is that this particular case was very special case in the Great Terror, because here the Soviet Union specifically tried to create fake documentation of Tukhachevsky's crimes through Western powers. They infiltrated false information about Tukhachevsky in different countries, like in France and Nazi Germany and UK, and they were trying to feed those countries this information and hoping that they will actually somehow they will believe that information, and they will start processing this information through their own state apparatus, and then the Soviets could steal that fake that information and include it into the case against Tukhachevsky, and that's exactly what happened. So it was a very elaborate attempt to actually create a kind of belief unbelievable case of treason. But already in the late 1950s and early 60s, this case was completely dismissed by the Soviet power, by the Soviet leadership.
Great. Thank you for that. And I'm going to go take some of the questions as they came in the talk. So at one point we were talking about Stalin and his mental condition. And James Evan asked, regarding the question of why Stalin was so extreme and vicious in his purges, does one really need medical records? I'm a retired, I think that's physician, or perhaps suggest that his actions might prompt consideration that at least part of his motivation was that he was simply a bloodthirsty, paranoid sociopath. What do we, how do we square the conditions that you're talking about and Stalin's own mental state? And what do you think of this question?
Well, I think that he was a sociopath. There is no question about that. He didn't present himself this way, so he never really lost temper. But that's also natural. It's normal for people of that with that condition. They actually usually can control themselves very well, and they can enact the different personalities relatively very well. And they can, of course, endear themselves to different people and show what they expect people want from what they would what kind of show things that they would think people actually would appreciate. Like my point was that even if we recognize that he was this way, we still cannot really explain why the purge took place in 1936, 37, 38, 39, why he hadn't done it before, why it also discontinued relatively very sharp, at a particular time when he decided that it was done. So that really doesn't explain like what was the agenda, how this, why the agenda started in this, why the agenda starts basically 4 years before the next war that he actually was very much anticipating. The explanation, like, and when I was talking about his medical condition, it's just I was just making a kind of a factual observation. Like, we don't have his medical records. Of course, we can assume that he was definitely paranoid, and the mixture of paranoid ideology and his paranoid personality, of course, was a fateful marriage that allowed him. But there is also some. I mean, I'm horrified by this personality that actually was willing to take the lives of millions of people in the name of grand historical agenda of preserving and preparing the country for the next war. So he actually had to make a calculation where he would, because he's he's a sociopath, he had to make some kind of calculation where he would be thinking, is it worth it to go through this risk, because it is still risky, killing this, basically getting rid of these people, and then preserving the rule of the Communist Party and the kind of what he inherited and what he owned at that time, or whether it was not. And he clearly decided that it was worth it.
Thank you for that. And I just want to say, Rich Haney, we have your question, but because your question is about something a little bit more contemporary, I'm going to get to that a little bit later in the question and answer session and move right now to Paul Connick's question. Is the notion of the potentially suspicious merely a catch-all for anyone Stalin and his agents might wish to imprison, send into internal exile, or execute? Or does it identify targeted individuals on the basis, not of their personal conduct, but on a categorical basis, for example, their profession or class?
The people who were purged came from very different backgrounds, and all attempts to try to figure out some kind of rationale, age-wise, profession-wise, but even social background-wise, actually would not work, because every time when you will say, well, okay, they just targeted this group of people, you will find a different group of people that actually just do not belong to the first. So you either have to create a very deep, like a very long list of different groups that happen to be targeted, or you have to admit, well, actually they didn't really target people by surface, kind of on the surface of what they did and what they could possibly, what they did professionally or privately. Here, I think I didn't mention one important fact about the Great Purge, is that the Great Purge was actually driven by quotas. Different regions, towns, cities, village committees actually received a particular number of people that they were supposed to arrest and physically removed from society. So it was a modern state using its institutions, trying systematically take people out of society. And once this, of course, the Bolsheviks would be very kind of those committees that were working on behalf of the Communist Party. They will pay special attention to those people who served in the White Army, those people who came from from the wrong social background, those people who took too long to start working for the Soviet state. Or people who tried to immigrate but couldn't do it. So these obvious enemies would be immediately masked. But then once these people will be interviewed, tortured, and tortured again, these people will be naming different, like they will be basically uttering different names, and those names that will be uttered will be brought to the committee's attention. And here, where there is no systematicity, because people could name a worker, a peasant, like a teenager, a mother, or someone they just didn't, or someone that they accidentally remembered. So this purge didn't have a very perfect kind of size, perfect rationale, and I believe that that's precisely why they actually decided on the quota system, because they just wanted to cast a very wide net and take out people who would be potentially, who would ended up being mentioned in those interrogations.
Great, thank you for that. And I want to let people know we have a lot of questions. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can before our session tonight is over, but we will keep as many of these as we can. And we ask you, of course, you can always ask questions of the panel session if we don't get to it. So speaking of a lot of questions, Jonathan Gerard asked about 4 questions in one. Jonathan, I'm going to take the first half of this question, and maybe we can revisit the second half. But the first half is, does the Bolshevik Revolution and its aftermath prove the fallacy of Marxism, that the masses can organize and overthrow their oppressors? Does Stalin's legacy show that the higher up in a society one is, the more organized one's group is, and the better able it is to advance and preserve its interests?
Well, I think that what the Bolshevik example really proves, it proves that when you decide to use Marxist ideology or socialist ideology in a country which is economically underdeveloped, and also in a country where the majority of people actually didn't want the Communist Party to be in power. Like, let us remember that the Bolsheviks came to power without popular support. They came to power as in the form of a coup. At that time, even the working class didn't support the Bolshevik Party completely and fully. They stayed in power because they managed to organize the Red Army, and they managed to negotiate with the peasantry, promising them land, right? So this is not really about Marxism necessarily. It's about a group of remarkably like driven intellectuals who definitely in 1910s have a vision of a just social society, and they also have to make a decision whether they want to take an opportunity when they had an opportunity to come to power, and try to use the state to industrialize and so civilize the society that they believed that was not civilized and was not industrialized enough. So the Bolsheviks. So the moment you actually, so it's very difficult to say, well, what exactly does the Soviet case prove? Because at every step, Bolsheviks were compromising, changing their philosophy, and also having to turn very abstract ideological tenets into concrete policy measures and particular policies. And this is where theory really doesn't have any inherent script of how it should be taken to practice, how it should be turned into practice, right? So this group of political individuals actually did it this way, and it was very much conditioned by Russian historical and economic and social peculiarities. So I think that we can more say about socialist system once we actually look at the Soviet Union after World War II. Mm-hmm. When after the Soviet Union had industrialized, it had won World War II. It had won the war on the Eastern Front. Like the Soviets usually say that they won the war. So what do they do in 1960s when they already have an industrial base, when they already have a society that actually is more or less supportive of the system, and what kind of policies do they carry out at that time? So that will be a better case study for thinking about what exactly, and also they become more Marxist and more socialist at the time than they would be in the 20s and 30s, because in the 20s and 30s, they are dividing people in different class types into different basically biological types, not that the biological type that cannot be inherited, but something that was conditioned by your social background. So this is, it's not about socialism. It's about preparing the grounds for possibly building a juster society.
Okay. And it does sound the more organized, the better, right? In terms of the second part of Jonathan's question. We have a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get to as many as we can. I want to remind you, we have a whole hour for questions coming up on Friday if we can't get to all these today. Joe Sitter asked, dictators need enablers. Where was it? Your comments on the importance of the Soviet secret police organization Cheka to Stalin's iron-fisted control, please.
Well, I mean, the purges needed support not only of the secret police. The purges needed support from the Soviet state and the party. So when I talked about these three-man committees, it was very important for Stalin and his allies to have different representatives of the Soviet power included. So where you would have representative of the secret police, you will have also representative of the Communist Party, and you will have a representative of municipal or some form of municipal government. So these people were involved because they could understand the logic. I mean, and people who would be picked to do this job actually would be the ones that will be reliable people who also would understand the the larger goal of what's happening is that we're trying to clean society of basically kind of people who are not potentially reliable. Right? So we're talking about millions of people involved in the carrying out of the purges. So we cannot really put blame only on the secret police. Mm-hmm. It's a much more so we can because different institutions were involved for a very long period of time, like for several years, in processing and organizing. And the purge needs first of all needs to be organized. Names need to be initial list of names needs to be written. Once the initial list of names is written, these people need to be arrested. Then these people need to be actually processed into their prison. They need to be and they need to enter prisons. Then they have to spend several weeks interrogating them, collecting more names, and then going. So it's a very long process, and if we need to kind of put I'm just resistant to blame only the secret police. I think this is it's a society that was deeply antagonistic from within. And it just came out of the Civil War where 20 million people died. And before that, they fought World War I. They also had just gone through the collectivization. So it's a society that actually is driven by hatred. And this is a form, we can talk about what actually was the driving force behind this purge that actually allows people to join and participate in it, is that actually it's like Stalin is really using the class antagonisms that the society had been accumulating for at least 20 years, if not more. So that's of course, is directly involved in different aspects of organization, but they're not this is not the only institution that we should talk about.
Great, thank you for that. Again, we're coming up to the end of our allotted time. If you will honor us with maybe one or two more questions, and then we will again keep any of these questions or ask you to come back and ask them again on Friday if we don't. And Rich Haney, I did promise I would get to yours, but I'm going to do maybe one before that. And this is from Abby. By executing Bukharin and assassinating Trotsky, Stalin appeared to be going after the Soviet intelligentsia, of which he was not a member. Could you comment on that?
I would disagree that he went after Soviet intelligence alone. He definitely went after Soviet intelligentsia, but he also went after all Bolsheviks who would not identify themselves as Russian intelligentsia. He also persecuted working class men who joined the Communist Party before the revolution and actually became working class intellectuals. He executed peasants. So that's that. If there will be just intellectuals that will be targeted, we can actually the purge will be much smaller. It wouldn't last that long, and it will not be a question of millions of people.
Great, thank you for that. I have a question from Bill Bolin. How did Zhukov, we can answer these maybe quickly, how did Zhukov survive the purge? And if he calculated war, why non-aggression pact? Why was there a non-aggression pact?
Um,
I assume the second is for Stalin, or
yes,
perhaps, yeah.
Mhm. Well, I mean, Zhukov at the time was not a very high-ranking officer yet. He just hadn't made it his career yet, and the military purge directly benefited him, even though without his intent. So Zhukov would not have been Zhukov had Tukhachevsky been not removed.
Okay.
Like and Zhukov was a very good general. He actually learned a lot during World War II, and he probably had been already very well prepared by 1941. But the Red Army would have been in much better shape by 1941, precisely because there will be officer corps that could stand up to Stalin and explain to him why it is not wise not to prepare for the possibility of the assault when the possibility of the German attack is being basically reported to Stalin every week in 1940, 1941. So, and the question about the 1939 non-aggression pact is just why it was necessary.
Well, yeah. Why, if war is inevitable, why that move?
Mm-hmm. Well, because Stalin is a very manipulative thinker, and he actually really liked to make people play his game. He believed that he can actually manipulate Hitler. I mean, like, we need to remind ourselves, Hitler is someone that no one, like, is a non-known entity in 1930s. He just came to power out of nowhere. Stalin is much more suspicious of Great Britain and France because he understands them as being true enemies of the Soviet Union. He tried to arrange a pact with those powers, but he couldn't do that because Britain and France also were very suspicious of the Soviet Union and Stalin in particular. So Stalin's key agenda in late 1930s is to keep in mind that the war is inevitable, but to carry it out on his terms. So his ideal scenario would be to carry out the purge, which he did, and he believed that he prepared the society for possible kind of. So by the fact that he carried out the purge, we actually can say, well, he actually anticipated the possibility of having war on the Soviet territory, because otherwise that would not have been it would not be as crucial. He also, so his ideal scenario would be to prepare the society for war, ideologically and politically. It was very important for Stalin in late 1930s to have at least 2-3 years to completely reorganize the army, and also to reman it and rearm it. So he needed 2-3 years before. Basically, he needed 2-3 more years in 1939, 1940 to actually be able to make the Red Army completely cutting edge, up-to-date military machine. And this is the period when the Soviets actually are bringing new machinery into the army, and they also need to train new officers to be able to operate those machines. You don't do it automatically. So he needed, he also really would prefer a scenario when Nazi Germany first attacks Great Britain, and when it is actually worn out by Great Britain, then the Soviet Union can decide on what terms it's going to enter this war, and clearly already on much more advantageous kind of terms. So this is the scenarios that he's playing out in his mind, and he miscalculated.
Great, thank you. Well, here's what we're going to do, folks. We're going to take Rich's last question, and then I'm going to, unfortunately, this includes my dear friend Lloyd Kramer, who has a wonderful question. But Lloyd, that question might be a great way to start out our panel in terms of broadening that on Friday. Lloyd will be our moderator for the panel. Please, I'm sorry if I did not get a chance for your questions, but it is around dinner time. So the final question is from Rich Haney. It was actually our earlier question, but it's about more contemporary issues. And I want you to feel as comfortable answering this as you would like. And it's about the current leader of Russia. Is Putin leading a Stalinist model for his own approach to power, or is his own approach more of his own, and we'd be forced to say, brilliant creation?
I don't think it's a brilliant creation. I think he is.
That was in the question, to be clear.
I don't think it's a brilliant creation. I mean, actually, I would really wish we could talk, we could have included Putin into our seminar, because Putin is a very great example of very subtle, postmodern kind of dictator. Who is drawing on Stalin's legacy, and in a very direct way. He actually, the Russian textbooks are now including Stalin into text. They actually refer to Stalin. They refer to Stalin as a major states builder, like a statesman. Up till 1990s, you wouldn't read such statements about Stalin in Soviet textbooks on history. That would not be possible to find. In 1960s, in Soviet school children would learn about the crimes of Stalinism. By 1970s, 1980s, they would not learn details of the crime, but they would not be reading any praises of Stalin. The actual Stalin will be kind of very removed and marginalized. And then the history of the Soviet Union de facto would not really have much to say about who Stalin actually was. When I was growing up in the Soviet Union, I had very vague understanding who Stalin was until things start changing, right? So Putin is clearly using Stalin as a model that justifies his particular way of rule, where he promises order, he promises that he will defend the Soviet people from unjust pretensions of the West. He also he is really using and borrowing Stalin's geopolitics and interaction with the West very, I believe, in a rather conscious and unconscious manner. But what I would say, I don't think it's a brilliant brilliant construct, is because in Russia, all these moves are rather obvious. Like, it is impossible not to be reminded of Stalinism when you see how Putin actually presents himself to the West, the way he blames always foreign enemies to be actually instigating protests in Russia. Like, every word, every sentence, every move that he makes, I actually remind people in Russia of Stalin's cult. And Russian people had been reading about Stalinism and thinking about Stalinism at least since 1960s, right? I mean, 1950s even, right? So yes, he has accumulated enormous amount of institutional power, and it's very difficult to fight against him, but he is undermining his political support and social support in the society. Great. So I will not exclude a scenario like in Belarus.
Okay, well, that's good to know, and certainly we can.
I hope.
We can bring up any other conversations, and I do want to thank everyone who has given us a question. We love your engagement. We're sorry that time is what it is. But we're very happy to have the panel session to delve back into some of these topics. Let's put our hands together, or you can hear the applause, right, of all of our participants out there. Thank you so much. Please join us tomorrow. Miguel Lucerno will be giving his wonderful talk por la patria, looking at dictatorships in Latin America, and I'm sure we'll have a lot of crossover between many of the themes. Anna Krylova, thank you so much for doing this, and we will have you back on Friday to do the panel session, and again, hopefully, to do Soviet women in the military. That's still a fascination for us. So thank you so much. Thank you to Paul Bonici, who's always doing such great work of technology, and for our audience of Carolina Public Humanities staff members. It's great to see you, Susan, and Lloyd, of course. Everyone, have a wonderful evening. Thank you, Anna.
Very much.
Much appreciated.
For this opportunity to talk about Stalin
Great.
and socialism.
Great. Well, we'll revisit it on Thursday. And we wish everyone a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.